Classic.
So the reason my talk is called The Land of Oz, I'm going to tell you a joke, but it may come up again in this talk, is while filming, well, first of all, when Judy Garland was, not Judy Garland, when Frank L. Baum's kids were growing up, and his name was Frank Lyman, it was Lyman Frank Baum, but he didn't like the name Lyman, so he went by Frank. But when they were growing up, he did all the magic tricks he could to entertain them and make them, laugh. And every Christmas, he did this thing where he came behind the curtain, sound familiar, and would surprise them with all of these wonderful, delightful tricks and funny skits. And so they would always go, oh. And so really the first known reason why the books were called The Land of Oz was because of that Oz. But then when he was telling children one day a story, he was telling them the story all about, all of his characters in the Land of Oz. And he was in an office, and the kid said, well, what land is this? But he didn't call it Oz then. And he looked up at a file drawer. This is the most prominent story, is he looked up at a file drawer, and he was eye level with the drawer that marked O to Z. And he says, oh, it's the Land of Oz. But it matches both stories. So isn't that wonderful? So this is a sad joke. So while filming The Wizard of Oz, and it's all true too, 16-year-old Judy Garland was put on a diet of chicken, soup, coffee, 80 cigarettes a day, uppers to keep her perky and downers for her to sleep, and then the punchline is, the golden age of Hollywood. Nothing keeps a young lady slimmer than an iron lung. So, yeah, that was bad. That was bad. But it was true. All of that was true. She was required to smoke 80 cigarettes a day to keep her not to eat, and also she was like allowed lettuce leaves, and everybody watched her. Even Louis B. Mayer watched her to make sure she didn't gain a pound. So. It is about Frank L. Baum, and Buzz, can you put up Lyman Frank Baum? Frank L. Baum is what he was known for as an author. There he is. He was handsome. He was a really handsome guy. And so when he met his wife, Maud, they were both young, and he was a Methodist. And as his Methodist, he was also he came from a wealthy family, and the father had failed at many businesses. He grew up in a very successful family in upstate New York, and during that time the father went through highs and lows, and they put him in school, and Frank just did not want to study. He was off daydreaming always. They put him in military school, and he didn't want to study. He just wanted to daydream all the time. And so finally he came to his parents and said, you know what I really want to be is an actor. That always went over big. And so especially there was not even television or films in at that point in time. It was in the early 19th century. So he always was in his head. He was always that dreamer in his head. But when he met Maud Baum, he was instantly smitten with her. And you'll see her picture later sitting with Judy Garland. But the reason he was instantly smitten with her was not only was she beautiful, it's going to be hard to tell from that picture because she's like in her 80s or 90s when the picture, but she was a beautiful young woman who was no pushover. She was strong. She was the daughter of Matilda Gage, and Matilda Gage was on the forefront of the women's suffragette campaign, along with Anthony B. Susan Anthony, and also Elizabeth Cady. They were all together. They were all cohorts in this, and so most of Matilda Gage's energy and time went to making the vote right for women. And so she grew up with a really strong mom. But there was another element to Matilda Gage that was really interesting, and what that element was is that she was on she was also a huge seeker of spiritual wisdom, and at the time was Theosophy with Helena Blavatsky. Does everybody else know Theosophy here? Oh, yeah, Crotona. And so Helena Blavatsky was a girl who married a prince in Russia by order. She wasn't in love with this guy at all. But see, she married this Russian prince, and she became the Russian princess who ran away from home, so to speak. And so she ran, but she was always that spiritual seeker. And so she founded the Theosophy group. And what I thought was so interesting is that was my first introduction to anything spiritual or metaphysical at all. And I'll tell you a little about the Theosophy in a moment. But is that she ran away, she founded the Theosophy group, and she traveled all over the world too, with many, including Krishnamurti from Ojai, and Alcott, I forget, is it Sam Alcott? Sam, I'm not sure, but his last name was Alcott. They traveled all over the world, India, gathering all the information they could. And the first place they landed in California to form a branch of Theosophy was at the top of Beechwood Drive. Does anybody know Beechwood Drive in Hollywood? Yeah, yes. It's right underneath the Hollywood sign. And I did not realize this until just a little bit ago. When I was born, I came home to a Beechwood address. I have to look it up. And then after I was divorced, I lived under that the Hollywood sign on Beechwood for a while. Rented an old house there with a friend. And I couldn't believe that then I come up to, and that's where all the Theosophists hung out at that time. All of the great thinkers and spiritual wisdoms, they would meet at that cafe underneath the Hollywood cross in the 20s and 30s and 40s. So when Helena Blavatsky came to Ojai, and some of you are Ohioans, that would be Gina and Belinda. And so do you know Crotona too? Did you ever hang out there or anything? I know you, Gina, don't you? Did you know about Crotona?
I knew about all of it. Somebody had once told me that Ojai had more churches per capita than anywhere else in the world because the valley is sacred because it goes east-west rather than north-south.
Oh.
Which most valleys go north-south, so it goes east-west. So the Indians called it Ojai. They said that Ojai would capture your soul. It was so sacred and you would always want to stay there. So. Yeah,
you know, there's something else I know about Ojai too, is there in all of the places, I was not going to talk about that, but I do remember that because of the energetic presence of Ojai, of who it attracts there too, is amazing, like the Krishnamurtis and the Blavatskys and a lot of other people too, and the Annie Besants, and all of those.
John Lennon.
Huh?
John Lennon, a lot of people don't know that either.
Oh! John Lennon had a place.
Last summer when he took off from Yoko, he was in Ojai.
Oh my God! It says it all. John Lennon. Well, all of those say it all. To be quite honest, but they call it the Happy Valley and the Peaceful Valley, and there has never been a war fought there, even between Indians and Europeans. Nothing. It's always been that peaceful valley. Well, that's interesting because one of Helena Blavatsky's followers was Annie Besant. And Annie Besant took her own path in Theosophy, and she actually founded the Ojai Valley School, which is all that valley, for students on that path for wholeness and learning and spirituality. And also, she was one of the founding members of Meditation Mount, along with Krishnamurti and others. And Meditation Mount, who's been to Meditation Mount? Yes, we have to take you there. Those who have not raised their hands, you're just gonna be, it's wonderful. It's just wonderful. Yay! It's just wonderful place, and the energy is so great up there as far as I'm concerned. And it is so peaceful, and it attracts a lot of people. And they have a lot of wonderful water up there too, that I remember when I was in my 20s, we used to go up, or maybe 30s, maybe closer to 30s, when Patrick and I would go up and get water there from the waterfall all the time, up at the top above Miners Oak. Anyway, it is. So I was first introduced to The Wizard of Oz when I was 4 years old, and it came back out in the theaters, and all we had was black and white TV at that time, and I was in the balcony with my dad. I've told this story before, at the Pantages Theater, and when that color came on, when that house lands and the rainbow comes up, And she walks out the door and the whole land is color. I'll never forget it. It imprinted on me so strongly. It imprinted out through my youth, the magic of that whole film. It imprinted throughout my adulthood and now in my senior life too. I still am amazed. So I have done a lot of research to see, because it seems so mystical. And the first clue I had, with all the mysticism behind it, I thought, is this it was Frank L. Baum, a religious scientist? No, he was a theosophist, and he actually left the Methodist Church to join his wife and his mother-in-law in that teaching. And he always came from that theosophy, where they believed this is very similar to religious science. Only one power, one presence. All the aspects in that power and presence are mirrored throughout all of life, all of nature, and that we are one in our mind and our hearts and our souls, and that is where we come from. They were monistic. They believed in that one power, call it God, call it Buddha, whatever you want, but it was the thing itself. And that explains so much about not only Frank L. Baum's nature, which was one of great just knowing that it was all going to work out, although for a lot of their lives, Maud and Frank were poor actors traveling around, and everywhere they went, they had difficulty everywhere they went with money, or theaters closing down or burning down or something else. But she was the money. She was not only a theosophist, but she was the money. She held strong. She made sure there was money for her kids to go to school, no matter where they lived or anything else. She was truly the wind beneath his wings. And at one time, when she was just so fed up, Christmas was coming, the goose is getting fat, please put a penny in the old man's hand. All I can think of that song. Anyway, but when they had no money at all, she was so upset and so sad. And all he said to her in all those times of marriage, according to Maud Baum, is, please have faith in me. Just please have faith in me. And that Christmas, just before the poorest they'd ever been, they were about to lose everything, he sold his Ahhhs, the first books, and they got a check for like $50. She thought it was like $50. It ended up being $3,000. Now, can you imagine in early 1900s getting $3,000, and they were in South Dakota, in Aberdeen, South Dakota. So it was just a miracle that it happened, and it changed everything for them at that point in time. So the film has always been magical for me. And again, I've read so many things about Frank L. Baum, but I had never even thought of looking at Maud Baum, and then someone gifted me with the book Finding Dorothy. And if you're interested in old Hollywood, you're interested in about the Wizard of Oz, if you're interested about anything, I invite you. It is the most amazing read. The woman who wrote it, Elizabeth Letts, is a #1 best-selling author, and she weaves all of the Bauman's life through Maud Baum's look at all of her life with Frank L. Baum. And they had 3 boys, by the way, too. And how she weaves all of this from the beginning to through the very end, where they ended up in Culver City, and right by the MGM studios, right in the back of the MGM studios, which are now the Sony studios, and now the Sony studios, where anyway, enough. So by the Sony studios, but where they were filming The Wizard of Oz at that time, after Frank had died. So I found a lot of my answers to what was happening with that mystical part of Frank L. Baum through the story in Finding Dorothy, and it was so fascinating. And one of the things that was so fascinating about the story was that Maud Baum literally insinuated herself into Louis B. Mayor's office, and insisted on that she see him. Frank had been dead for about 20 years when she went in to see Louis B. Mayer and demanded that she wanted to make sure that this picture captured the spirit and the love and the magic of what her husband was. And so he was kind and patted her a little bit. Said, okay, not a problem, Mrs. Bond. You could be, you could be like a consultant on the film, but she was so much more than a consultant. She ended up befriending Judy Garland. And Buzz, can you put up that picture of Maude and Judy together? There they are, Maude Baum. And again, she's in her 80s at that point in time. And Judy Garland. And she was absolutely horrified to find out how Judy Garland was treated during her stay in Hollywood, that beginning of the stay. And a lot of, by the way, the Oz books were based on the Baum's family. Not only the Wizard of Oz and Oz, but also it's like all of the sad things that happened are part of that Wizard of Oz, and how they overcame so much by literally recognizing who they were was the divine within, and that to draw from that power from the divine within is how you build your spiritual muscle and how you make that magic in your life. But it's not magic, it's reality. So sometimes when reality, we see it, it's not really real, as the Course in Miracles says. It is something that is playing out, but who we are is real. Our soul is real, our hearts are real, our feelings are real, and you just have to remember that you have to go home and check in a lot. And especially these days in our society where there's so much information happening all at once, there seems to be so much violence. They have the appearance of violence. There has to be the appearance of so much anger all around us in this world. And so we have to check in and know that the truth is that there is peace. It's unfolding more than you can ever imagine by your thoughts, your thinking, by staying in the moment and knowing, not denying what's happening around you, but knowing that we're better than that we rise higher than that we see a truth much greater than that in all situations. So it is very important. And in this book, there are so many good times, but the hard times were really very, very hard. So after many financial struggles, as I said, The Wizard of Oz was published, but the references in the book, her niece and Frank L. Baum's niece, Magdalena, is really, she is Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. And Dorothy had and Magdalena had a horrible, horrible childhood with her sister. It was beyond poverty stricken. It was she was emotionally deprived in so many ways. And several times the Baums tried to adopt Magdalena, and that did not happen. It just didn't happen at all. So she led this really unhappy life, but every time Magdalena was with her Uncle Frank, they had this pretend girl that she would talk to. It was her pretend friend, and that was Dorothy. So actually, Magdalena is, the pretend friend is the name Dorothy, and Frank would talk to her just like Magdalena did, and she was so happy. The prairie dogs that were all around them in another state, I think, well, it could have been South Dakota, but way out in Nowhereville, where Magdalena and her mom and her dad lived, they would shoot them constantly and shoot the wolves constantly. It was really a tough area. But the prairie dogs were Toto. So the Toto, and she would pretend, Magdalena would pretend that Toto, the prairie dogs were riding in her basket. She had always wanted a bicycle, never had the money to get a bicycle, but she had a pretend basket, a pretend dog, and she had a pretend friend, Dorothy. And so a lot of all of that came from the stories. I want to go back now to Culver City, 1939. They're filming The Oz. And there's a story that Judy tells Maude about her mother. And her mother would tell Judy all the time that being a star, although she wasn't glamorous, would make Judy happy. So no matter what she did, the mother was committed to making Judy a star, because Judy was her ticket home, her lunch ticket, her meat ticket, her meal ticket. And so no matter, but she never said, "You're beautiful, you're wonderful." She said, "You've got to do this. even though you're not all of these things that we need you to be. You're not magical, you're not, charismatic, but you better show up, suit up, and do this. And it was under her mother's guidance that she smoked the 80 cigarettes a day. She had what they called them, I'll look it up in just a minute, but the pills, the downers and the uppers, and the diet and everything else. She and Louis B. Mayer were on her all the time, because Judy was 16 years old playing an 11-year-old. And Maude was very upset about this, because when she met Judy, she saw she was a teenager. She had breasts, and they taped down her breasts, made her as thin as possible so that she would pass for an 11-year-old in this film. And so she went through a lot to be in this film. So Judy actually told Maude this story. And so Maude replied, "Let me tell you something about stars, Judy. I once lived in Dakota where the stars shone like bright diamonds, so close you truly believed you could reach up and pluck one from the sky. Some people are born like that, growing so bright. My Frank was one of those, and so are you. Be yourself, Judy. I promise you that who you are is already good enough." And Judy replied, "That my mother always says. Work hard, give them what they want, and you'll be a star someday." She said, "But my father said, she's not going to be a star. She already is one." So her father was very supportive of her, but her father died when she was very young. So she didn't have a lot of the support from her father, that loving support. So she and Maude actually bonded. At one point, the film was too long, and Louis B. Mayer decided to cut out the song "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." But can you imagine the Wizard of Oz without "Somewhere Over the," because in those days, they didn't have 5-hour films like we do sometimes here, or 2 hours or 3-hour films. No, it had to be on a timeline. Yip Harburg, who also wrote songs with my biological father, Earl Holly Robinson, was sitting at Schwab's one day before even the Wizard of Oz happened or anything else. And he did not know that when Frank Baum and Maud first came to Los Angeles, they went to Schwab's constantly. He's sitting in Schwab's. He doesn't know if Frank L. Baum was there at the time, but all of a sudden, that song, he absolutely channeled "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," the words and the music and everything else. It was a little too fast when he first laid it out, and then he slowed it down to the classic "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." So it was magical, almost like Frank was coming through him. So when they were going to cut that story out, Maude went to Yip Harburg and said, "You can't do this because I have a secret." And he said, "I have a secret too about this song." And what her secret was is that she had never told anybody this. But one day when Magdalena was so sad and they were on the prairie and they were just so unhappy, she went to Frank, and Frank went to comfort her. And he said at that time, I may read this. He said at that time, this is the story he told little Magdalena, who became Dorothy. As the wagons began to roll away, he's looking back, and he says, this is what he says. Her dress is blue gingham, Uncle Frank, just like mine. She's telling him about how her dress matched Dorothy's. And she said, "And I have a meaty bone for the dog." And then he says, "I'm sorry, Magdalena, but the pup," oh geez, I'm so sorry. I'll just tell you, he said, "Honey, wherever you are, look up and see that rainbow. And I want to tell you that when you see a rainbow in the sky, I am always there. I'm always in your heart. Rainbows are magical. And I invite you to come and just know that I am with you. Every rainbow you see, at the end of the rainbow is the perfect story for you, and you are with me." And it helped Magdalena let go of him in that moment. It was a very, very difficult time for everyone. So Maud and Yip Harburg, so she had her story about the rainbow, and she loved that story, and Maud cried all the way home, leaving her sister and her niece Magdalena that day. But it was her story, Frank's story about the rainbow, nobody knew about at all. Yip Harburg had written the song about it. They confronted, Louis B. Mayer was not someone you could budge, and any decision he made, head of MGM, they went and they snuck in. They had to literally push their ways into Louis B. Mayer's office and convince him, using all of the magical things, to leave the song in. What Yip Harburg knew and Maud Baum did not know is Louis B. Mayer believed in magic, and when he heard both stories, he started to cry, picked up the phone and said, leave the song in, leave the rainbow song in. So it was so magical, that whole field. So when Judy sang Somewhere Over the Rainbow, Maud knew that Judy had done it. He had captured the magic that Frank had put in her heart and that film for her to portray in a greater way. So another little spiritual fact was that Dorothy's ruby red slippers weren't in the original book. They were silver slippers. And the reason they were silver is because in many spiritual religions, and especially in theosophy, they talk about the silver cord tying you to the heaven world. And so the silver slippers were in that flow of being tied to the heaven world during this entire film. There are so many magical spiritual stories that occur during the filming of The Wizard of Oz, but the most magical one woven all throughout this story was the one about the jacket. And the jacket was one, they said, for the wizard, Frank Morgan was the actor of the wizard, they said, you have to get a jacket that's befitting a wizard. They send a guy to a secondhand store, he comes home with a jacket, and he said, they told me it was Frank L. Baum's jacket. And so Judy is now convinced that she's in the flow, that this is magic, and that not only is it magical, but that Frank L. Baum is with her at all times during this entire film. Maud wasn't skeptical. It looked like something Frank would have worn, but she wasn't so sure about the whole thing. So she never said anything to Judy, and then toward the end of the shooting, Judy came to her and said, this has been so magical, and especially the jacket. Maud said, honey, I don't know about that jacket. She said, quite frankly, I think it was a publicity stunt. Judy was crushed, absolutely crushed. And so when she was crushed, what she pulled out was this little piece of wadded up paper with Frank L. Baum's writing. He wrote toward the left, which was unusual, and this was on this piece of paper that she had been keeping. If anybody's cold, you can turn down the air. I see people rubbing their arms and stuff. So she holds this up to show Maud, and she says, what is it, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Judy smoothed out the scrap of paper, and then she read out loud. This was in this jacket pocket. The Rainbow King's daughter sprang from her seat and leaped on the arched bow that awaited her. Dorothy could no longer see her, but blew kisses toward her with one hand and fanned goodbye with the other. Suddenly, the end of the bow slowly lifted from the earth, and its colors ascended, fading into the clouds, and she, along with the bow, were gone. And so it was Frank L. Baum's jacket, and I can't imagine. And so she took it off, Maud took it back and said, I am so sorry that I said anything. And also then Judy felt that she was divinely protected. It was very important to her after all of the hardships she had had during the shooting of that film. So on May 5th, 1919, Frank Baum suffered a stroke. The following day he slipped into a coma, but he said one last thing to Maud Baum, his wife, as he lay in his bed. He came awake just to say this line, and in this line he spoke his last words. I'm with the heart, said the Tin Man, because the brain does not make anyone happiness, and happiness is the best thing. Now we can cross the shifting sands. Isn't that wonderful? Frank L. Baum made his transition as he lived magically. He died magically. And I'm going to ask Buzz not in closing. Yeah. Yes, oh, in one of the closings, If I Only Had a Brain. It's a melody, by the way, and it's black and white because they didn't have it in color. So here we're watching the If I Only Had a Brain song.
While away the almond, confirming with the plum, consulting with the rain. In my head, I'd be scratching while my thoughts were busy hatching if I only had a brain. I'd unravel every riddle for any individual in trouble or in pain.
With the thoughts you'd be thinking you could be another Lincoln if you only had a brain.
Oh, I tell you why, the ocean's near the shore. I could think of things I never thought before, and then I'd sit and think some more. I would not be just a numbin', my head all full of stuffin', my heart all full of pain. I would dance and be merry, life would be a king of dairy if I only had a brain. When a man's an empty kettle, he should be on his mettle, and yet I'm torn apart. Just because I'm presuming that I could be kind and human if I only had a heart. I'd be tender, I'd be gentle, and awful sentimental regarding love and art. I'd be friends with the sparrows and the boy who shoots the arrows if I only had a heart. Picture me about honey, above a voice sings low.
Where art thou, Romeo?
I hear a beat. How sweet just to register emotion, jealousy, devotion, and really feel the part. I could stay young and chipper, and I'd lock it with a zipper if I only had a heart.
Yeah, it's sad, believe me, missy, when you're born to be a sissy without the feminine vibe. But I could show my prowess, be a lion, not a mouse, if I only had the nerve. I'm afraid there's no denying, I'm just a dandelion, a fate I don't deserve. I'd be brave as a blizzard,
I'd be gentle as a lizard,
I'd be clever as a gizzard.
If the wizard is a wizard, who will serve
then I'm sure to get a brain, a heart,
a home?
The knife.
And you know, they go to the wizard, and I have another clip. But also, I want to say, Ernest Holmes, by the way, lived very close to the Baums. And you always wonder whether they knew one another or not. It is so interesting to me that at that point in time, all of these spiritual seekers came together, and I see that it is happening again. So I have a quote from Ernest Holmes about good for me. So oh gosh, where is it? Anyway, it was about the imagination that Ernest Holmes' teachings on the science of mind mirror many of the same teachings as Theosophy. It is one of the branches of that metaphysical teaching that we all know that there is something that exists greater than we are, and we can't always touch it, taste it, feel it. And so he said, I live in the faith that there are a presence and power greater than I am, that nurtures and supports me in ways I could not even imagine. I know that this presence is all-knowing and all-power and is always right where I am, and that true imagination is not fanciful daydreaming, it's fire from heaven. And we can see that throughout the film. So there's one more closing clip, and it's from the closing, one of the closing scenes of The Wizard of Oz.
And I'm just a very bad wizard.
What about the heart that you promised Tin Man? And the courage that you promised Cowardly Lion?
Well, I'm Scarecrow's Day. Why, anybody can have a brain. That's a very mediocre commodity. Every pusillanimous creature that crawls on the earth or slinks through slimy seas has a brain. Back where I come from, we have universities, seats of great learning, where men go to become great thinkers. And when they come out, they think deep thoughts, and with no more brains than you have. But they have one thing you haven't got, a diploma. Therefore, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Universitatis Comitiatum e Pluribus Unum, I hereby confer upon you the honorary degree of Ph.D.
PhD?
That's Doctor of Thinkology.
Sum of the square roots of any two sides of an isosceles triangle is equal to the square root of the remaining side. Oh, John! I've got a brain! How can I ever thank you enough?
Well, you can't. As for you, my fine friend, you're a victim of disorganized thinking. You are under the unfortunate delusion that simply because you run away from danger, you have no courage. You're confusing courage with wisdom. Back when I come from, we have men who are called heroes. Once a year, they take their fortitude out of mothballs and parade it down the main street of the city. And they have no more courage than you have. But they have one thing that you haven't got. A medal. Therefore, for meritorious conduct, extraordinary valor, conspicuous bravery against wicked witches, I award you the Triple Cross. You are now a member of the Legion of Courage.
Shucks, folks, I'm speechless.
As for you, my galvanized friend, you want a heart. You don't know how lucky you are not to have one. Hearts will never be practical until they can be made unbreakable.
But I still want one.
Back where I come from, there are men who do nothing all day but good deeds. They are called good deed doers. And their hearts are no bigger than yours. But they have one thing you haven't got, a testimonial. Therefore, in consideration of your kindness, I take pleasure at this time in presenting you with a small token of our esteem and affection. And remember, my sentimental friend, that a heart is not judged by how much you love, but by how much you are loved by others.
Oh, it ticks! Listen, look, it ticks!
Read what my medal says. Courage. Ain't it the truth? Ain't it the truth?
Oh, they're all wonderful.
Hey! What about Dorothy?
Yes, how about Dorothy?
Yeah, Dorothy next.
Here, Dorothy,
Oh, I don't think there's anything in that black bag for me.
well, you forced me into a cataclysmic decision. The only way to get Dorothy back to Kansas is for me to take her there myself.
Oh, will you? Could you? Oh. Oh, but are you a clever enough wizard to manage it?
Child, you cut me to the quick. I'm an old Kansas man myself, born and bred in the heart of the western wilderness. Premier balloonist par excellence to the Miracle Wonderland Carnival Company, until one day, while performing spectacular feats of stratospheric skill, never before attempted by civilized man, an unfortunate phenomena occurred. The balloon failed to return to the pair.
Did?
Weren't you frightened?
Frightened? You are talking to a man who has laughed in the face of death, sneered at doom, and chuckled at catastrophe. I was petrified. Then suddenly the wind changed, and the balloon floated down into the heart of this noble city, where I was instantly acclaimed Oz, the first wizard deluxe. Times being what they were, I accepted the job, retaining my balloon against...
And Glinda shows up and says you could always go home. And just click your heels 3 times and you're home, because home is where you're at. And that is we have probably all, has everybody seen The Wizard of Oz at least? Yeah. Okay, so Frank Lyman Baum made his transition as he lived. He magically did it, and his magic lives forever.